The branch was heavy, its dead weight a familiar ache in her shoulders. Eleanor Vance leaned into the task, her boots finding purchase in the cracked, thirsty earth. The sun beat down on the back of her neck, a merciless hammer of light and heat. Ahead of her lay the field, a scar of pale dirt and withered scrub that everyone in the valley knew as the barren quarter, the patch of land on the Vance ranch that had never given anything but dust. She dragged the gnarled limb of cottonwood behind her, its passage carving a shallow, temporary wound in the ground. The sound was the only thing that broke the silence, a dry, scraping whisper, like the earth itself sighing in defeat. She did not look up. She did not look at the distant haze of the mountains or the long shadow of her own solitary figure. She just pulled. One step. Then another. The wood groaned against the dirt, a complaint against its own slow journey toward a purpose no one else could see. If you've ever felt the weight of the world on your shoulders, a burden that felt too heavy to pull and too precious to let go, then keep watching. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and what small hope you're tending to in your own patch of barren ground. It had started in the quiet that came after. The terrible, echoing quiet that filled the small ranch house after Joseph was gone. The quiet was heavier than the grief itself. Grief was a sharp thing, a sudden pain that could take her breath, but the quiet was a slow suffocation. It settled in the corners of the rooms, clung to the curtains, and lay beside her in the empty bed. The ranch, once a place of shared labor and simple dreams, became a monument to his absence. The fences he'd mended sagged. The barn door hung crooked on a single hinge. The land itself seemed to mourn, the soil turning to a fine, grey powder that the wind lifted and spun into melancholy devils. Her neighbors were kind, at first. They brought casseroles and offered condolences in hushed, practiced tones. They were good people, weathered by the same sun and scarcity that had shaped her own life. But their kindness was edged with a pity that felt like a judgment. They saw a woman alone, a widow with 160 acres of unforgiving land and no man to work it. They saw an ending. In their eyes, Eleanor was already a ghost, haunting the memory of a life that was over. They gave her a season, maybe two, before the bank would take the land or she would be forced to sell for pennies to one of them. It wasn't malice, it was pragmatism. It was the hard calculus of survival in a place that offered little charity. Eleanor heard their whispers when she rode into town for supplies. She saw the slow, sad shake of their heads. She felt their eyes on her back, tracing the lines of her solitude. She bought her flour and her salt, her coffee and her beans, and said little. The town was a chorus of doubt, and she had no words to offer in her own defense. What could she say? That the grief hadn't broken her? That the silence hadn't driven her mad? They wouldn't have believed it. They had already written her story. So she turned away from their faces and their voices and looked instead to the land. Joseph had loved it, every stubborn acre. He had seen potential where others saw only hardship. It's not mean, Ellie, he used to say, his hands full of the dry soil. It's just waiting. You just have to know what it's waiting for. After he was gone, those words became her only inheritance of any real value. The land was waiting. One morning, as the sun rose pale and thin over the eastern ridges, she walked out to the barren quarter. It was the ranch's great failure, a patch of ground so poor and alkaline that even the sagebrush struggled to survive. Joseph had tried. He'd plowed it, fertilized it with manure from the small herd, and planted it with everything from corn to hardy beans. Nothing took. The sun baked the seedlings before they could root. The rain, when it came, was a violent deluge that stripped the topsoil and ran off in muddy torrents, leaving the ground harder than before. It was a place of ghosts, the ghosts of failed crops and broken hopes. Standing there, in the heart of that failure, Eleanor felt a strange sense of peace. This was the bottom. There was nowhere to go but up. She looked past the barren field, toward the low, scrub-choked hills that bordered her property. They were a tangled mess of fallen timber, dead branches bleached white by the sun, and thickets of mesquite that had died in the last drought. It was the land's refuse. Firewood, at best. A nuisance, at worst. But as she stood there, a new idea began to form, a whisper of a thought that had its roots in one of Joseph's old books, a worn-out farmer's almanac from a country she couldn't even place on a map. An idea about decay and rebirth, about burying the dead to feed the living. She went back to the house, put on Joseph's old work gloves, picked up his sturdiest burlap sack, and walked toward the hills. She didn't have a plan, not a fully formed one. She just had a starting point. She would gather the fallen branches. The work was brutal. The sun was a constant adversary. The branches were thorny and awkward, snagging on her clothes and scratching her arms. She started small, gathering what she could carry in the sack, her back screaming in protest by the time she returned to the barren quarter to deposit the meager pile. It looked absurd, a small heap of dead wood in the middle of a dead field. Pathetic. She ignored the thought and went back for more. Day after day, the routine was the same. She would rise before dawn, tend to the few chickens and the single milk cow that remained, and then walk to the hills. She gathered wood until the heat became unbearable, then retreated to the shade of the porch for a lunch of bread and water, returning to her task in the late afternoon and working until twilight bled from the sky. The pile grew, slowly, agonizingly. From a heap, it became a mound. From a mound, it became a long, sprawling collection of skeletal limbs, a boneyard of forgotten trees. It didn't take long for the neighbors to notice. Their ranches were spread out, but the valley was an open book, and a lone woman engaged in such a strange, relentless task was a story everyone could read from a distance. The first to comment was Mrs. Gable, a woman whose tongue was as sharp as a new tack. She saw Eleanor in town, her hands raw and her face smudged with dirt. "Eleanor, dear," she'd said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Are you clearing the hills for a fire break?" Such heavy work for a woman alone. Eleanor simply shook her head. No. Not a fire break. The answer, in its simplicity, was unsatisfying. It invited more questions, which Eleanor had no intention of answering. The speculation began in earnest. They decided she'd gone mad with grief. It was the only explanation that made sense. She was building a pyre, some said, a monument to her dead husband. Others, more cruelly, whispered that she was collecting the bones of the land because her own life had been picked clean. Her project became a local curiosity, a landmark of sorrow. Going to see the widow's woodpile became a dark little joke among the ranch hands passing on the road. She heard them. She felt their stares. But their judgment was a distant noise, like the buzz of flies on a hot day. It couldn't touch the core of her purpose, the quiet, humming thing that got her out of bed each morning. The work was a balm. The physical exhaustion muted the ache in her heart. The scraping of the branches across the dirt was a sound she could control, a rhythm she could create in the overwhelming silence of her life. She was not building a pyre. She was building a foundation. One afternoon, a wagon pulled up at the edge of her property. It was Mr. Abernathy, her nearest neighbor to the west. He was a man of few words and even fewer smiles, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the sun. He and Joseph had maintained a relationship of mutual, silent respect, mending their shared fence line without ever exchanging more than a nod. He sat in his wagon, watching her for a long time as she dragged a particularly large log from the hills. Finally, he spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "That's a lot of work for a bonfire," he called out, his voice a low rumble. Eleanor stopped, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her glove. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It's not for burning," she said. He squinted, his gaze drifting from her to the enormous, sprawling pile of wood. It was 30 feet long now, and nearly as wide. It snaked across the barren quarter like the spine of some great, dead beast. "What's it for, then?" She paused, considering her answer. The truth was too complex, too fragile to be exposed to the harsh light of his pragmatism. "It's for later," she said, and turned back to her work, the conversation clearly over. He watched for another minute, then clicked his tongue, and the wagon rumbled away. She expected his judgment to be the harshest of all, but his visit had felt different. It was not mockery. It was assessment. He was a man who understood work, and he had seen the sheer scale of her labor. He didn't understand her purpose, but he could not deny her effort. From then on, when he passed, he still didn't smile, but he would sometimes give a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was the first crack in the wall of her isolation. Autumn arrived, painting the cottonwoods along the creek in strokes of brilliant yellow. The air grew crisp. The work changed. The gathering was mostly done. Now came the digging. She marked out a long, straight line next to the woodpile, a trench 80 feet long and 4 feet wide. She took Joseph's shovel and broke the earth. The ground fought back. It was a compacted mix of clay and stone, baked hard by a decade of relentless sun. The first few inches were a grueling battle. The shovel blade would ring against buried rock, sending jarring vibrations up her arms. Blisters formed on her palms, broke, and bled, turning the wooden handle of the shovel dark with her effort. Every foot of progress was a victory. The town's talk had died down to a low murmur. Her madness, it seemed, was no longer newsworthy. They had accepted it as a permanent feature of the landscape, like the strange rock formations on the ridge or the lone, lightning-scarred pine at the valley's entrance. The widow and her woodpile were simply part of the scenery now. She dug. She dug until the trench was a deep wound in the earth, a gash nearly 5 feet deep. Her body screamed. Her muscles burned with a fire that never went out. Some days, she could barely haul herself out of the trench, her limbs trembling with exhaustion. But she never stopped. The trench was the vessel. It had to be ready. As she worked, she began to see the logic of the land's failure. The soil was dead because it held no water. The rain, when it came, was a fleeting gift, a torrent that swept over the hardened surface and was gone in an hour, leaving the ground just as thirsty as before. It needed a sponge. It needed a heart. When the first trench was finally finished, she began the slow, arduous process of filling it. She didn't use dirt. She used the wood. She started with the largest logs, laying them carefully at the bottom. Then came the thicker branches, fitted together like pieces of a puzzle. Then the smaller limbs, the scrub, the twigs, every last piece of the great pile she had spent a season gathering. She packed it down, walking along the length of the trench, stamping the dead wood into a dense, interwoven mass. It was a burial. She was laying the bones of the forest to rest. When the trench was nearly full of wood, she covered it with the earth she had excavated, shoveling the hard, clumpy dirt back over the branches until a long, raised mound was formed, like an enormous, elongated grave. The sight was unsettling. From a distance, it looked as though she had buried a giant. The whispers in town started again, this time with a more macabre tone. They said the grief had finally consumed her, that she was practicing a burial for herself. She ignored them and started digging the next trench, parallel to the first. Winter came. The first frost laid a delicate, silver filigree over the raw earth of the mound. The ground hardened, making the digging nearly impossible. She used a pickaxe now, the sharp clang of steel on frozen earth echoing in the cold, still air. Her breath plumed in front of her. She worked in layers of wool, her face numb, her fingers stiff. This was the true test. The easy doubt of the summer had given way to the hard reality of winter. The land was at its most unforgiving. A blizzard swept through the valley, burying everything in a deep blanket of white. For 3 days, she was snowed in, forced to wait. The silence in the house returned, deeper and more menacing than before. But this time, she had an anchor. The thought of the trenches, the buried wood waiting patiently beneath the snow, kept the despair at bay. As soon as the storm broke, she was back outside, shoveling a path to her work, her determination a small, warm flame against the vast, cold indifference of the winter. She finished the second trench, and the third, and the fourth. By the time the spring thaw arrived, turning the ranch into a sea of mud, for long, parallel mounds dominated the barren quarter. They were strange, alien shapes on the landscape, stark and raw. They didn't look like part of a farm. They looked like earthworks for a fortress, or the burial mounds of a forgotten tribe. Then came the spring rains. They were not gentle. A fierce thunderstorm rolled in from the west, unleashing a torrent. Water cascaded down the hills, turning the dry creek beds into raging rivers. She watched from her porch as sheets of rain lashed the valley. She saw her neighbors' fields flooding, the precious topsoil washing away in brown, churning streams. She watched her own mounds, her heart in her throat. The raw earth on the slopes began to erode, carving small gullies in the sides. For a moment, she feared it was all for nothing, that the storm would undo months of labor in a single hour. One of the mounds, the newest one, suffered a partial collapse, exposing the pale, skeletal branches within. A gaping wound. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening under a returning sun. The damage was significant, but not total. She went out, her boots sinking into the thick mud. Her neighbors were assessing their losses, the despair plain on their faces. She picked up her shovel. She just kept building. She repaired the collapsed mound, packing the earth back into place, reinforcing it with stones she gathered from the creek bed. Each time there was a setback, she simply began again. A section of trench caved in. She dug it out. A windstorm scattered a pile of branches she had yet to bury. She gathered them up. Her response was always the same, quiet, immediate, wordless recommitment. She was no longer just working the land, she was in a conversation with it, learning its harsh language of flood and drought, wind and stone. That spring, Mr. Abernathy was out checking his fence line, the one that bordered the barren quarter. It had been a dry month since the big storm, and the land was already cracking again. His own pasture was turning a dusty brown. As he walked, his eyes were drawn to Eleanor's mounds. He'd seen the storm damage and had figured that would be the end of her strange project. But the mounds were whole again, stronger even. And there was something else. He stopped, leaning on a fence post. The earth on top of her mounds was different. While the surrounding field was pale grey, cracked like old pottery, the soil of the mounds was a darker brown. It looked damp. He walked closer, his curiosity overriding his usual reserve. He reached over the fence and pressed the toe of his boot into the side of the nearest mound. The ground gave way, soft and loamy. He could smell it, the rich, dark scent of living earth, a smell that had no business being in this part of the valley during a dry spell. And then he saw it. A tiny flicker of green. A weed, a sprig of wild grass, sprouting from the top of the mound, vibrantly alive. He looked from the green shoot to the parched, lifeless ground of his own property. He didn't understand the mechanics of it, but he understood the result. The woman wasn't mad. She was doing something. Something that worked. He turned and walked back to his wagon, his expression thoughtful, the first seeds of respect taking root in his own stubborn soil. A week later, Eleanor brought the saplings home from town. They were little more than twigs, a dozen young apple trees in burlap sacks, their roots carefully bundled. The store owner had given her a pitying look when she'd bought them. Planting an orchard in the barren quarter was like trying to raise fish in a bucket of sand. It was a waste of good money. She spent a full day planting them, one by one, along the crests of her full-long mounds. She dug into the soft, rich earth, her hands moving with a surgeon's care. The soil was a revelation. Beneath the surface, it was moist and cool to the touch. The buried wood, now beginning to rot and break down, was doing its job. It was holding the water from the winter snows and the spring rains, acting as a subterranean reservoir, a secret well of life. The mounds were not graves. They were wombs. She planted the last sapling as the sun began to set, its light turning the sky to shades of orange and rose. She stood back, her body aching, her hands caked in mud, and looked at her work. The dozen frail sticks looked impossibly small and vulnerable against the vast, empty landscape. It was an act of audacious, irrational hope. The community watched. The saplings became the new focus of their speculation. They gave the trees a month. When the summer heat arrived in full force, those little sticks would wither and die, and that would be the end of it. The heat came, a wave of shimmering, oppressive air that bleached the color from the sky and baked the life out of the land. The grasses in the valley turned to straw. The creeks ran dry. It was a brutal, unforgiving summer. But the trees didn't die. They didn't flourish, not at first. They simply endured. While other plants withered, their leaves turning brown and curling in on themselves, Eleanor's little apple trees held on. Their small leaves remained green. She watered them sparingly, carrying buckets from the well, but she knew it was the earth beneath them that was keeping them alive. The buried wood, the water waiting as Joseph would have called it, was nurturing the roots, giving them the moisture they needed to survive the onslaught from the sun. They didn't die. The phrase became a silent mantra. Through the punishing heat of July and the dry winds of August, the trees held on. It was a small, quiet miracle, visible to anyone who cared to look. Another year passed. The seasons turned, each one a chapter in the slow story of the land's transformation. The mounds, once raw earth, were now covered in a carpet of clover and hardy grasses that Eleanor had sown. The apple trees, no longer fragile saplings, had grown. They were still small, but their branches were thickening, their leaves were lush and green. They looked like they belonged. The contrast was now impossible to ignore. The barren quarter was no longer barren. It was an oasis of deep green in a valley of pale brown. It was a testament, written in leaves and soil. The mockery had long since faded, replaced by a confused, grudging silence. People didn't know what to make of it. They had been so certain of her failure, so comfortable in their judgment, that her quiet success was unsettling. It challenged the very laws of their world. It suggested that they didn't know the land as well as they thought they did. The turning point came in the autumn of the third year. It was a good year for apples, for those lucky enough to have an established orchard in the fertile lands near the river. But no one expected a harvest from the widow's folly. Yet, as the days grew shorter and the air sharpened with the coming cold, something remarkable happened. The small trees on Eleanor's mounds began to fruit. At first, it was just a few blossoms, then small, hard green knobs. But they grew, and ripened, and reddened in the autumn sun. It was not a bountiful harvest, not by the standards of the river orchards. The apples were small, and some were misshapen. But they were undeniably there. Dozens of them, hanging like jewels from the branches of the young trees, a defiant splash of crimson against the brown landscape. The whole community could see it from the main road. The visible, undeniable proof of her success. The silence broke. Mrs. Gable was the first to visit. She came not with a sharp tongue, but with a freshly baked loaf of bread in her hands. She stood at the edge of the orchard, her gaze sweeping over the mounds, the green grass, the apple-laden trees. She looked at Eleanor, who was gently testing an apple on a low-hanging branch. There was no triumph in Eleanor's eyes, only a quiet satisfaction. I don't understand how," Mrs. Gable stammered, the words catching in her throat. "This land, it's poison." Eleanor turned, her expression calm. "The land isn't poison," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It was just thirsty." The next day, two ranchers who had once laughed at her woodpile stopped their wagon. They didn't say much. They just stood for a while, shaking their heads in disbelief. One of them finally cleared his throat. "How did you do it, Mrs. Vance?" Eleanor didn't give them a lecture on soil science or water retention. She gave them a simpler truth. "I gave it back what it had lost." The visits continued. People came with questions, with offerings of food, with a new and profound respect in their eyes. They were not just seeing a successful orchard, they were seeing the physical manifestation of a will they could not comprehend. They had watched her toil for 3 years, had mistaken her resilience for madness, and now they were faced with the undeniable fruit of her labor. Their world had been tilted on its axis. One evening, as dusk was settling, she heard the rumble of a heavy wagon. It was Mr. Abernathy. He pulled up, not at the road, but right at the edge of her field. The back of his wagon was piled high with fallen cottonwood branches, cleared from his own property. He got down from the seat, his movements stiff. He didn't say a word. He simply unlatched the tailgate, and with a great heave, sent the load of dead wood tumbling to the ground. He secured the gate, climbed back onto his wagon, and gave her one of his short, solemn nods. Then he drove away. Eleanor stood there as the last of the light faded, looking at the gift of wood. It was an apology, an offer of help, and a treaty of peace, all delivered in a single, silent gesture. The next morning, she started marking out the line for a fifth trench. Before she had been digging for an hour, she saw a figure walking across the field toward her. It was one of the young ranch hands who had joked about her pyre. He carried a shovel over his shoulder. "Figured you might use an extra hand," he said, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and resolve. Soon after, another came. And then another. By midday, a small group of her neighbors were there, men and women, digging alongside her. They worked in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the rhythmic scrape and thud of shovels in the earth. They were no longer just her trenches. They were the valleys. The people who had once been her judges had become her partners. She never mentioned their past mockery, and they never apologized for it. The shared work was apology enough. The orchard, growing and green, was forgiveness enough. Eleanor Vance stood on the porch that evening, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The ache in her shoulders was a familiar friend. Below her, 5 long mounds now lay across the field, with the promise of more to come. Her solitary labor had become a communal project. The silence of her life had been filled not with the echoes of what was lost, but with the quiet, hopeful sounds of a future being built. They had all looked at her and seen a woman burying her past in the dirt. They were wrong. She was planting it.